Could you believe that behind the crowns, the wars, and the royal marriages, there were English kings who shared their hearts and sometimes their beds with men? We're told these rulers were symbols of strength, faith, and family. But the hidden letters, private diaries, and suspiciously close friendships in the records suggest something far more complicated. From medieval courts to the early modern age, whispers of secret affairs follow the throne disguised as politics, erased by historians, or quietly rewritten by the church. Were these kings victims of their own time, forced to hide? Or did they use secrecy itself as a weapon of power? The truth lies buried beneath ceremony and silence. Tell me which would shock you more, a king's secret lover, or how far history went to hide it. Share your thoughts in the comments and drop the time you're watching. And if you love history that dares to ask forbidden questions, consider subscribing. No pressure, but the next story might change how you see royalty forever. You walk quietly through the old halls of England's royal castles. The walls are lined with portraits of kings' faces, serious, proud, untouchable. But if these paintings could talk, they would tell stories that history books never dared to print. Stories about love, friendship, and feelings that didn't fit the rules of their time. Tonight, you're not just looking at kings, you're walking into their secrets. People often imagine kings as strong men with clear duties, rule the land. Fight the wars, produce an heir. Simple. But behind those crowns were human hearts, and human hearts don't always follow the law. Some of England's kings had emotions and attachments that history tried to erase or hide behind polite words. Chroniclers didn't dare write love. Instead, they wrote things like his most beloved companion or his trusted friend. Those phrases meant more than they seemed. You can almost picture it, grand banquets with golden cups, laughter echoing through the hall, and two men exchanging glances across the table when no one else was watching. There were friendships that grew too close, gifts that spoke louder than words, and rumors that never died. Back then, people couldn't talk openly about those things. The church and the nobles demanded that every royal marriage produce children, heirs, and alliances. But hearts don't care about alliances. It's strange, isn't it? The same kings who ruled armies and built empires couldn't rule their own hearts. They could send men to war, but they couldn't admit who they truly loved. A single rumor about a king's private life could destroy reputations, shake faith in the monarchy, or even start rebellions. So everything had to stay hidden, locked away behind smiles, power, and ceremony. If you think modern tabloids are bad, imagine living in a time when gossip could get you executed. Medieval courtiers whispered behind fans and church walls about who slept where and why certain men always seemed to get promoted. Some kings surrounded themselves with favorites who were given lands or titles and attention no one else received. Officially, it was for loyal service, but the court always suspected more. And yet, there was another side to it too. In that world, men often expressed affection differently. Warriors kissed each other on the cheek, cried when friends died, and wrote poetry to their companions. It wasn't always romantic, but sometimes it was, and no one dared say so out loud. Maybe you felt that kind of bond too, something too deep to explain, something others wouldn't understand. You move deeper into the castle, where the air smells of old wood and candle smoke. Somewhere behind these walls, scribes once burned letters and diaries to protect reputations. The smoke carried away words that could have changed how we see these kings today. Sometimes all that's left are clues, a poem, a line in a letter, or a gift that seems too personal to be political. It makes you wonder how much truth has been hidden under the word friendship. How many kings lived double lives? Public rulers by day, secret lovers by night. It's a strange kind of loneliness, isn't it? To have the world bow to you, but not know your heart. You stop before a locked wooden door. Behind it lies the first of many stories, a king known for his fiery red hair and an even more fiery reputation. He laughed louder than anyone, dressed better than anyone, and had a court filled with charm danger and rumors that refused to die. You push open the heavy wooden door, and there he is, William II, also known as William Rufus, the Red King. The nickname wasn't just about his hair. People said his face turned red with laughter, wine, and temper. He ruled from 1087 to 1100, and from the start, people whispered that he was different. William grew up as the son of William the Conqueror, the man who took England by force in 1066. But while his father was a soldier king, rough and practical, Rufus loved elegance. He built fancy halls, wore rich silks, and surrounded himself with handsome young nobles who adored him. To the church, that alone was suspicious. To his court, it was scandalous and irresistible. People said his court felt more like a theater than a government. The nobles, dressed in bright colors, wore perfume, curled their hair, and spent hours gossiping about fashion. Imagine a royal influencer party, but with chainmail and goblets instead of champagne and cameras. Church leaders were horrified. One monk wrote that Rufus's men looked more like brides than warriors. Another called the king's court a place of wicked beauty. Of course, no one ever wrote plainly what wicked meant. Back then you couldn't say much without risking your life. But the rumors stuck. The chroniclers complained that the king never married, never showed interest in women, and had unnatural affection for certain male companions. One name appears more than once: Ranulph Flambard, his advisor known for his charm and quick wit. Ranulph had the king's full trust, and his many guessed his affection. When other nobles hated him, Rufus promoted him even higher. When Flambard was later imprisoned, it was said the king nearly lost his appetite. That's not something kings usually do for an advisor. Still, Rufus wasn't soft. He was fierce in battle, quick to anger, and loved danger. He rode fast horses, hunted endlessly, and loved showing off his strength. But people couldn't forget the parties, the laughter, and the favorites who seemed to rule beside him. In one strange way, he lived like a man testing his own legend, half hero, half rumor. If you had met him, you'd probably like him. He was funny, generous, sometimes cruel, but always interesting. You'd also notice the tension in the air, the courtiers watching him too closely, the priests avoiding his eyes, the scribes hesitating with their pens. Everyone was trying to decide what kind of man he truly was. And then came the ending no one could explain. In August 1100, William Rufus went hunting in the New Forest. It was supposed to be a normal day, horses, arrows, laughter echoing through the trees. But he never came back. An arrow struck him in the chest. The official story said it was an accident, but you can almost hear the raised eyebrows in every corner of England. Some said it was revenge from God for his sins. Others whispered it was murder planned by those who couldn't stand the king's private life any longer. When his body was carried back to Winchester, the courtiers who once laughed beside him disappeared into the woods. Even Ranulph fled. The church, which had condemned him in life, now praised him in death for convenience, not sincerity. They buried the Red King under a cathedral floor, as if trying to bury his reputation along with him. If If you visit Winchester Cathedral today, you can still see his tomb. Most people walk past without stopping. But imagine standing there, hearing the faint echo of that old laughter, seeing the flash of red silk in the torchlight, and realizing this man ruled an empire, defied a church, and lived on his own terms. Whether the rumors were true or not, William Rufus became a symbol of something forbidden and fearless, a king who refused to live small. And as the candles flicker across the stone, you feel the air grow heavier again. Another shadow waits just beyond the hall, a warrior even greater, a crusader known for his battles, but remembered for something far more intimate. The next corridor feels colder, but brighter too. Shields hang along the wall, each marked with a golden lion. At the end stands a statue of Richard, better known as Richard the Lionheart. He's the hero of countless tales, the king who fought in the Crusades, battled Saladin, and became the symbol of English bravery. But as you look closer, you start to see another story hidden beneath the armor. Richard wasn't like other medieval kings. He spoke mostly French, spent almost no time in England, and loved poetry as much as war. He was brave, yes, but also proud, theatrical, and full of contradictions. And for centuries, whispers followed him not about his battles, but about his heart. The first hint comes from his youth. Before becoming king, Richard was close, very close to Philip II of France. The two princes met when England and France were supposed to be enemies, yet they became inseparable. Chroniclers from both kingdoms wrote about how they ate together, planned together, and even, according to one bishop, slept in the same bed. That wasn't unusual by itself. Sharing beds was common in medieval Europe, but the bishop's tone was suggestive. He called their affection beyond the bounds of brotherhood. Imagine that scene for a moment. Two young rulers, both ambitious and clever, lying under the same tent after a long day of strategy and banquets. They share secrets, laughter, maybe even dreams of power. The medieval world was full of such alliances, but something about theirs made people uncomfortable. Was it just political closeness, or something more? Even the church got involved. Later in life, Richard confessed publicly for his sins of the flesh, though no one knows exactly what he meant. Some historians say he was admitting to affairs with women. Others think he meant something entirely different, something that had been quietly haunting his reputation for years. It's almost funny when you think about it. The man who led armies and terrified enemies might have feared his own emotions more than any sword. When he left for the Crusades, the relationship with Philip fell apart. Politics turned them into rivals. But the way chroniclers describe their reunion years later feels almost like heartbreak, disappointment, mixed with pride, anger, hiding affection. While Richard was away at war, stories about his personal life kept spreading. Some knights admired his loyalty and courage. Others gossiped about his companions and the way he favored certain men. You can picture the court whispering, trying to guess who would share the king's tent next. And yet, even if those rumors were true, no one could touch him. Richard's power, his victories, his larger-than-life image, those things made him untouchable. The church could hint, and nobles could whisper, but he was the Lionheart. His legend roared louder than any scandal. Still, when he returned from captivity, after being held hostage in Germany for over a year, he seemed different. Worn down, lonely. The energy that once lit up every hall now flickered like a dying flame. He ruled for a few more years, fought a few more wars, and then died in 1199, after being struck by an arrow during a siege in France. The man who spent his life fighting for glory died over a petty castle dispute, far from home, with no heir and no lasting peace. In a strange way, it fits a life full of noise, pride, and secrets ending in quiet confusion. When you stand before his tomb today, you'll find his heart buried separately in Rouen, France, in a little box under the cathedral floor. Historians say it was to honor his courage, but part of you wonders if there's a deeper meaning there, a man torn between two worlds, two nations, and maybe even two kinds of love. It's easy to see him as just another legend, another statue. But if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the sound of armor creaking and two young kings laughing in the dark before politics and pride forced them apart. The Lionheart conquered cities, but like so many for him, he never conquered himself. And somewhere down the corridor, another king waits a man who didn't hide his affection so carefully, a man whose love cost him his throne, his dignity, and almost his life. What if I told you there once was a king who risked everything, not for war, not for wealth, but for someone he couldn't let go? That's the story of Edward II, one of the most tragic and fascinating rulers England ever had. His name still sends chills through historians, not because of what he built, but because of how love nearly destroyed his crown. Edward wasn't supposed to be remarkable. He was the son of the great Edward I, the warrior king, who built castles and crushed rebellions. But when the younger Edward came to power in 1307, people quickly noticed he wasn't like his father. He loved music more than military drills, swimming more than politics, and most of all, he loved one man above everyone else, Piers Gaveston. Gaveston wasn't born noble. He was a charming Gascon knight, funny confident, and too smart for his own good. Edward met him when they were both young, and from the moment they became friends, they were almost never apart. He gave Gaveston land titles and gifts that shocked the entire court. At his coronation, Edward even placed Gaveston in charge of the royal ceremonies, ignoring the great lords of England. It was like making your best friend the star of your wedding, while everyone else just sat and watched in silence. And the nobles hated it. They called Gaveston arrogant, said he mocked them, and whispered that his influence over the king went far beyond politics. Soon, Edward's affection became a national scandal. Parliament forced him to exile Gaveston not once, but 3 times. Each time, Edward brought him back, no matter the cost. You can almost imagine the scene, the king standing on the castle ramparts, watching the ship carrying Gaveston vanish into the fog, knowing he'd bring him home again. And he did. Again and again. That kind of loyalty, that kind of devotion, it terrified his enemies more than any army could. But England wasn't forgiving. By 1312, the nobles had had enough. They captured Gaveston, held a sham trial, and executed him in secret. When Edward found out, he reportedly fell apart. He stopped eating, stopped speaking. His grief was so deep that even his enemies pitied him. Imagine a king, the most powerful man in the land, brought to his knees not by war, but by love. He tried to move on. He married Isabella of France, a strong, clever woman who would later be known as the She-Wolf of France. They had children, including the future Edward III, but the marriage was cold. Isabella knew she'd never have her husband's heart. Eventually, she turned against him, and so did the rest of England. Years later, she and her lover Roger Mortimer led an invasion against Edward. He was captured, forced to give up the throne, and imprisoned. What happened next? became one of the darkest legends in English history. Some say he was murdered in secret with methods too cruel to describe. Others believe he escaped and lived quietly in exile. The truth is still debated, but what's certain is that his story ended in betrayal and mystery. Even centuries later, people still argue, was Edward II a weak king, or just a man too human for his crown? His love for Gaveston might have doomed him politically, but it also made him one of the few medieval kings who felt real flawed, passionate, and heartbreakingly sincere. It's strange how history works. The same society that mocked him for loving too much would later praise kings who loved too little. But maybe that's what makes Edward II unforgettable. His enemies wrote him down as a failure, but his story lives because he dared to care in a world that punished emotion. If you ever visit Berkeley Castle, where he was last seen alive, the guides still lower their voices when they tell his story. The stone walls seem to remember the sound of someone crying in the dark, someone who lost everything but refused to stop feeling. And as you walk away from that cold prison, another sound begins to echo: music, laughter, and the heavy footsteps of a new dynasty. The Tudors are coming, and with them, a whole new layer of secrets waiting behind the golden glory. The air feels warmer now, filled with the scent of ink roses and expensive perfume. You step into the age of the Tudors, where everything glitters: silk robes, jeweled collars, and smiles that hide sharp minds. If Edward the II's story was about heartbreak, the Tudors turned secrecy into an art form. Here love wasn't just personal, it was political. And sometimes that made the lines between friendship, loyalty, and desire almost impossible to see. You start with Henry VIII, the king, with 6 wives and a reputation that fills entire textbooks. He might not seem like someone who hid his affections, but beneath all those public romances, there were strange undercurrents. Henry was obsessed with control. He ruled his court like a director casting a play. Men who pleased him, made him laugh, or shared his ideas often became more powerful than the women he married. And when one of those men fell out of favor, Henry's anger burned like betrayal. Take Thomas Cromwell and Thomas More, brilliant minds, completely different men. Henry once called them his most faithful servants. He trusted them with his secrets, then destroyed them when they disagreed. Love and loyalty blurred together in his world, and anyone who got too close risked losing their head, sometimes literally. But the most intriguing figure in this period wasn't Henry at all. It was his father's court, the one that came before. Because that's where the quieter whispers began. The young Prince Henry, who became Henry VIII, grew up surrounded by musicians, artists, and foreign courtiers, many from Italy and France, where male beauty and close male friendships were often openly celebrated. He wrote songs about beloved companions and faithful friends. It all sounds innocent until you read between the lines. Tudor poets had a habit of hiding forbidden feelings inside metaphors. Fast forward a few decades, and the court of Edward VI. Henry's sickly son takes things even further. He was only a boy king, but letters from his tutors show that affection among noble youths, sometimes deep, sometimes physical, was quietly accepted as long as no one said too much. It was like an open secret. Everyone knew, no one mentioned it. But the real masterpiece of Tudor secrecy belonged to James VI of Scotland, who would later unite the crowns as James I of England. Though not born a Tudor, he inherited their flair for elegant silence. As a young man, James surrounded himself with favorites, handsome nobles who became the subjects of poems, portraits, and jealousy. He called one of them, Robert Carr, the handsomest body of this time. Another, George Villiers, became his constant companion for years. James wrote letters to him that sound more like love notes than royal orders. One even said, "I desire only to live in your sight." Of course, the church and parliament didn't approve, but no one dared challenge a king over feelings. So the rumors swirled quietly like smoke from a candle. What's striking about this era is how carefully everything was hidden in art and poetry. Nobles exchanged gifts or wrote verses. They used coded language: the hunt, the rose, the flame. Those words could mean duty or desire. You never quite knew. And that's the charm of it all. The Tudors didn't erase their emotions, they disguised them. Even today, when you stand in the Hampton Court Palace, it's hard not to feel that tension in the air. You see paintings of men gazing at each other just a bit too fondly, poems that praise noble forms, and rooms designed for private counsel that were anything but innocent. You might think gossip was invented on the internet, but it was thriving in Tudor England long before hashtags and headlines. The only difference was the punishment for talking too much could be death, not just bad comments. So when someone tells you the Tudors were all about royal marriages and power games, remember this: behind those perfect portraits and arranged unions were hearts that didn't always follow the script. And among them was a queen whose mirror reflected more secrets than anyone ever guessed. You step through the next set of tall wooden doors, and suddenly everything feels theatrical music drifting through the hall. Gold light flickering off polished marble. The banners have changed. The Lion of England now shares space with the Thistle of Scotland. This is the Stuart Age, and sitting on the throne is King James III, the man who brought two kingdoms together and brought new meaning to the word favorite. James was clever bookish and a bit awkward in person, but he was also fiercely affectionate. Unlike the cold warriors before him, he didn't pretend to be distant. He liked conversation poetry, and most of all, companionship. The problem: the kind of companionship he preferred was always with young men, who made the rest of the court jealous. From the moment he became king, James surrounded himself with handsome courtiers. The first was Esme Stuart, a French noble who arrived when James was still a teenager. Esme was older, charming, confident, and within weeks, James was completely taken by him. They hunted together, prayed together, even wore matching jewelry. Letters from the time describe James as overwhelmed by affection. But Scotland's nobles hated it. They accused Esme of corrupting the young king both politically and personally. The friendship nearly caused a civil war. Esme was eventually sent away, and James was left heartbroken. You might think he learned from that experience. He didn't. Years later, when James became King of England, he met Robert Carr, a good-looking page who caught his eye during a tournament. Carr fell from his horse, broke his leg, and somehow fell straight into the king's favor. James visited him daily, showered him with titles, and made him a powerful courtier overnight. The English nobles grumbled, but they knew better than to question the king's affections. Still, Carr's story ended badly. He became arrogant, tangled in scandals, and was eventually replaced by a new favorite, George Villiers, later known as the Duke of Buckingham. Villiers was everything Carr wasn't: polished, educated, ambitious, and dangerously charming. James was nearly 50 when they met. Villiers was in his early 20s. The king adored him. He gave him mansions, jewels, even access to his private chambers at all hours. Their letters survive, and they're surprisingly tender. James wrote, I desire only to live in your sight, and I am your old faithful husband, and you, my sweet child and wife. Today, historians debate the nature of that relationship, but the affection is undeniable. For a man who ruled an empire, James wrote like someone desperate simply to be understood. Of course, not everyone found it charming. The nobles whispered, the Puritans fumed. Even Parliament joked about the king's favorites. But James never hid it. He insisted that love and friendship were part of God's design, and he saw no shame in feeling deeply. That boldness was both his strength and his weakness. Under James's reign, England flourished in literature and art. He sponsored Shakespeare, authorized the King James Bible, and dreamed of peace between nations. Yet behind the glory, the gossip never stopped. People said Buckingham's influence over the king was too strong, that England's politics were being steered by beauty, not wisdom. When James died in 1625, Buckingham was the one who closed his eyes and kissed his hand for the last time. There's something almost cinematic about it, a king who tried to mix affection and power, faith and feeling, and never apologized for either. Maybe that's what makes his story stand out. He wasn't a tragic figure like Edward II. He was simply human in a world that didn't want its rulers to be. If you ever visit Apethorpe Palace, where James and Buckingham often stayed together, you'll see the secret passage connecting their bedrooms. It's still there, a narrow hallway between two doors, silent proof that history always leaves a trace no matter how carefully it's hidden. And as you leave the room, you can almost hear their laughter fade behind you, replaced by the distant hum of drums and trumpets. The next kings won't have time for poetry or tenderness. Their courts will be filled with masks, power, and men who play dangerous games behind velvet curtains. What if I told you that after years of civil war, executions, and Puritan rule, England's new king brought back not holiness, but scandal? His name was Charles II, and when he returned to the throne in 1660, it wasn't just a political restoration, it was a restoration of pleasure. London's streets burst into music and theater again. Taverns reopened, and everyone pretended to forget the years of blood and prayer. But behind all that celebration was a royal court that looked more like a costume party than a government, and Charles was the master of ceremonies. Charles was tall, charming, and known for his humor. He loved to be surrounded by clever people, actors, poets, and courtiers who could make him laugh. And among them were men who shared more than conversation. One of the most trusted and affectionate of his companions was George Villiers, the second Duke of Buckingham, yes, the son of his father's favorite. History has a strange sense of repetition. The younger Buckingham was everything a Restoration noble was supposed to be: bold, witty, and just dangerous enough to keep things interesting. He and Charles had grown up together in exile and shared a bond that often crossed the line between friendship and obsession. They argued, plotted, and teased each other like brothers, or perhaps something closer. When Buckingham angered the king, he wasn't exiled for long. Each time, Charles forgave him and welcomed him back with a smile that made courtiers whisper. Charles's reign was full of rumors like that. He had famous mistresses, of course, Barbara Villiers, Nell Gwynn, Louise de Querouaille, but even those affairs felt like theater. His true comfort came from his male companions, witty playwrights, loyal courtiers, and the kind of men who could drink, joke, and stay up until dawn talking about philosophy and politics. The Restoration court blurred every line. Masculinity wasn't just about strength anymore. It was about charm, wit, and style. Think about it, after decades of Puritan control, England was starving for fun. Men wore long wigs, lace cuffs, and bright colors again. They danced, sang, and flirted shamelessly. It was a culture that celebrated beauty no matter who it came from. And Charles encouraged it. He even kept a group of young nobles, known as the Merry Gang, handsome, reckless men who raced horses, wrote poetry, and caused trouble in every corner of London. One of them, John Wilmot, the Earl of Rochester, became famous for writing verses that mocked love and power, sometimes so bold they had to be whispered behind closed doors. But beneath the laughter, Charles II was deeply aware of how fragile everything was. He had seen his father executed and his country divided. Maybe that's why he surrounded himself with beauty and loyalty. He knew how quickly it could all vanish. His friendships, even the dangerous ones, were his way of keeping the darkness away. When Charles died in 1685, his brother James II took the throne. James was nothing like him, serious, religious, and humorless. He tried to restore order and faith, but his court still carried whispers of the past. His household included young, charming officers who served as gentlemen of the bedchamber, a role that meant more than just guarding the royal room. Some of them were rewarded with strange favoritism, and pamphlets soon mocked the unnatural fondness of the aging king. It wasn't enough to destroy him, but it added to the gossip that made his reign unstable. When James was overthrown in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the party ended. England's new rulers, William and Mary, brought back Protestant discipline. But the candlelit world of Charles II, full of music, perfume, and whispered affection, never truly disappeared. It lived on in the plays, the poetry, and the memories of those who had danced through it. If you stand in Whitehall Palace, where Charles II once held his secret masques, you can almost feel the echo of that laughter, the kind that hides sorrow underneath. He ruled with charm, instead of fear, loved in his own way, and made England fall for him, even when it shouldn't have. Maybe that's the secret of the Restoration. Everyone wore masks, but for a few golden years, they finally got to choose which ones. And as the music fades and the candles burn low, you step into a new century. England is changing again. New kings, new empires, and a royal family that tries to look perfect in public while keeping the same old secrets behind closed doors. The air feels heavier now, thick with powdered wigs and the smell of ink. You've entered the Hanover era, the time of kings named George, a whole line of them. If the Tudors were bold and the Stuarts were theatrical, the Hanover kings were something else, entirely complicated men who lived in worlds full of gossip, restraint, and carefully hidden desire. It starts with George I as a German prince who became King of England in 1714. He spoke almost no English, hated London's damp weather, and spent most of his time with his male attendants, rather than his wife, who he locked away in a castle back in Hanover. People noticed, of course. His close friendship with one courtier, Baron von Kielmansegge, drew quiet snickers. The two hunted, dined, and traveled everywhere together. Letters from the time call the Baron the king's constant companion, which sounds polite until you realize that same phrase had been used for every royal favorite for centuries. Then came George II, his son. He married young and stayed loyal to his wife Caroline, which shocked the court, though not for long. After her death, the king turned lonely and withdrawn, surrounding himself with younger courtiers who reminded him of his youth. None were ever officially called favorites, but they filled his private circle men of fine form and cheerful manner, as one ambassador put it. You can almost hear the tone of that description, admiring, maybe even jealous. But the real storm brewed with George III, the king who would later lose the American colonies. History remembers him as mad strict and deeply religious. But in his youth, he had a different reputation, shy, emotional, and strangely attached to his male tutors. He wrote letters filled with warmth and dependency, the kind that made his advisors nervous. "Your absence makes the hours long," he once wrote, for a future king that was far too much honesty. When his mind began to fail in later years, the gossip came back harder than ever. Some claimed his madness was punishment for hidden sins, others that his loneliness drove him insane. In truth, George III simply lived in a time when any kind of deep feeling, especially between men, was seen as suspicious. So, he buried it. He talked to trees, to clocks, to anyone who couldn't judge him. Maybe that's what happens when you spend a lifetime pretending. By the time George IV came to power, England had changed. The 1700s had given way to the glittering chaos of the 1800s. George IV was a man of luxury, addicted to fashion and flattery. He adored artists, actors, and handsome young servants who knew how to make him feel adored. One in particular, Frederick Fitzclarence, the son of one of his mistresses, became the talk of London because of how openly the king showed affection toward him. It was scandalous, but George didn't care. He lived for admiration, whether it came from women or men. His reign marked a shift in how people talked about power and image. Masculinity wasn't about war anymore. It was about confidence, style, and charm. George filled his palace with mirrors and portraits of himself, but the real reflection was in the faces of the companions he surrounded himself with. They laughed at his jokes, flattered his vanity, and probably understood him better than any minister ever could. By George V, the gossip had grown more dangerous. England had entered the age of newspapers. Now secrets could no longer hide behind thick curtains and Latin diaries. The press followed every movement, every friendship, every letter. The royal family learned to smile for cameras and lock their feelings away tighter than ever. George Thaw, stern and conservative, made sure no hint of softness escaped. But even his court had its quiet friendships and unspoken loyalties, just less poetry and more discipline. It's strange to think about. Isn't it centuries earlier, kings were free to weep and embrace their friends in public? Now, even a kind smile could start a headline. The monarchy had learned to survive by pretending to be perfect. The old warmth, the honest affection, it didn't disappear. It just went underground, hidden behind duty and etiquette. If you walk through Kensington Palace today, past the rows of portraits, it's hard not to feel that silence. Every painting of a proud, stiff-backed king hides something human beneath the gold paint. A man who once laughed too loudly, trusted too deeply, or loved too privately. And from that quiet world of powdered wigs and polished lies, you step into an empire on the edge of modernity. The Victorians are coming with their strict morals, their iron rules, and their endless effort to look pure while pretending not to know what's happening behind their own curtains. The candles go out, and in their place comes the soft glow of gaslight. Welcome to the Victorian era, a world that worships manners, morality, and silence. Outwardly, everything looks proper. Men tip their hats, women faint politely. and no one ever admits that anything private even exists. But behind that perfect image, royal secrets grow deeper than ever. At the center of it all stands Queen Victoria. And yes, she's not a king, but her sons and grandsons are the ones who carry the next generation of hidden stories. Victoria herself adored her husband Prince Albert so much that when he died, she wore black for the rest of her life. Their love became the national symbol of moral purity. But that image was a shield one that covered what really went on inside royal circles, especially among the men. Her eldest son, Edward VII, became king after her death in 1901. Outwardly, he was every inch the gentleman's cigar mustache top hat charm. But he also loved pleasure theaters, racehorses, fancy dinners, and people who knew how to make him feel alive. Edward surrounded himself with gentlemen companions, most of them younger, witty, and handsome. He rewarded loyalty with titles and affection with gold. One of his closest friends was Maurice de Hirsch, a wealthy Jewish banker whose influence reached across Europe. But another far less official companion was René Bull, an artist and illustrator. Letters between them show surprising warmth, more personal than political. Historians can only guess what it meant, but the tone feels familiar, a man starved for connection behind the royal mask. Edward's public image was all about women, of course. He had mistresses, everyone knows that. But the emotional side of his life, the one that didn't make headlines, was softer. He admired male beauty in art-supported young artists and soldiers, and built friendships that were almost parental, almost protective, sometimes something more. The court called it Edward's Circle, and you can almost hear the knowing tone in that phrase. Then came George V, his son. Where Edward was indulgent, George was the opposite, strict, cold, and obsessed with respectability. He didn't like gossip jokes or scandals. He banned certain books, punished servants for improper behavior, and made sure the royal household stayed spotless. But maybe that's exactly why he tried so hard. Historians suspect that George V's harshness toward others came from fear. Fear that the public would look too closely. His letters to close male friends, especially naval officers, are full of tenderness, calling them dearest and most beloved. It doesn't sound like the man who barked orders at his sons. It sounds like someone trying to keep one part of himself safely hidden in ink. You see, Victorian England was a strange time. On the surface, it condemned everything that wasn't normal. In private, it couldn't stop talking about it. Secret societies, coded letters, underground salons all thrived, while the newspapers pretended not to know. And the royals weren't immune to that hypocrisy. They just played the game better. It wasn't until later that cracks started to show. When Edward VII's grandson, the future Edward VIII, grew up, people noticed he didn't fit the mold. He was charming, modern, and dangerously open about following his heart instead of duty. He surrounded himself with men of the arts, poets, and stylish courtiers. The older generation called them unmanly. The younger ones called them fascinating. By then, London had changed. Oscar Wilde had been imprisoned for love, the old world was dying, and the royal family was struggling to look untouched. But the truth was, even behind palace walls, human nature hadn't changed. Kings and princes still had secrets, only now they had cameras watching their every move. If you visit Sandringham House, one of the royal estates from this time, you'll see family portraits where everyone stands perfectly straight, not a hair out of place. But look closely, and you'll notice how stiff those smiles are. Those weren't just polite faces. They were masks polished over decades of pressure. It's strange, isn't it? The more England claimed to be moral, the more its rulers learned to hide. But repression never truly kills what it tries to bury. It just teaches it to whisper. And those whispers are what lead you now into the 20th century, where one royal decision, one act of love, will shake the entire British Empire to its core. What if I told you that the most romantic scandal in modern British history, the one that forced a king to abandon his throne, wasn't just about love, but about the right to feel it all? Because by the 20th century, royal duty had become a kind of prison, and emotion itself had turned into rebellion. The year is 1936. The new king, Edward VIII, is young, charming, and reckless. He smiles easily, speaks directly, and looks nothing like his stiff predecessors. The public adores him, but behind the headlines, courtiers panic. He has no wife, no heir, and far too many unapproved friendships. Newspapers gossip about his companions, actors, writers, and certain fashionable young men who seem to spend too much time at the palace. The press can't print everything, but they know. Everyone knows. Then comes Wallis Simpson, the woman history blames or credits for his downfall. She's American, divorced and impossible to control. The romance between them explodes across the world. But what few people realize is that the king's heart was already complicated long before she arrived. Edward had always lived on the edge of convention. He loved intimacy, but he also feared judgment. Some letters from his early life show an emotional hunger that goes beyond the neat image of womanizer. He longed for connection, not just companionship. When he abdicated, giving up the throne for the woman I love, it sounded simple, but that choice, leaving duty for feeling, echoed back through every generation of kings who had ever hidden their hearts. From Edward II's heartbreak to James I's favorites, from Charles II's charming companions to the hidden tenderness of George V, every royal who'd lived in silence suddenly felt vindicated. The crown was finally forced to admit kings are human too. Of course, the royal machine didn't change overnight. Edward's brother, George VI, took the throne and rebuilt the monarchy's image as a symbol of family and sacrifice. He was devoted to his wife, Elizabeth, but struggled with deep anxiety. He leaned heavily on his close male advisors, especially one, Lionel Logue, his speech therapist. Their friendship, captured in the king's speech, shows a kind of emotional intimacy that feels rare among royals. Trust, vulnerability, and care. Maybe it wasn't romance, but it was something the monarchy had long suppressed: honesty. Then came Queen Elizabeth II's reign, where perfection became policy. Her sons and grandsons grew up in a world of cameras, tabloids, and endless judgment. The palace's golden rule returned: never explain, never complain. But even silence couldn't hide everything. Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, known for his long bachelor years. Lord Mountbatten, whose diaries hinted at private complexities. And later, Prince William and Prince Harry, breaking tradition to speak openly about mental health. All are part of that same long chain of men caught between crown and emotion. It's easy to think the story of secretly gay kings and centuries ago, but really, it just changed language. Today's royals live under brighter lights, but face the same question: how much truth can a throne handle? If you look at the monarchy now, polished by documentaries and Instagram posts, you might think the age of secrecy is over. But history teaches otherwise. The British crown has always been an illusion of control, a story told to hide the chaos beneath. For every official portrait, there's a private letter. For every royal wedding, a quiet friendship. For every decree of duty, a whispered moment of doubt. And maybe that's why these stories matter, not because they expose scandal, but because they remind us that even the most powerful people in the world have hearts that disobey. You can build empires, pass laws, and wear crowns, but you can't order love. If you walk through Westminster Abbey someday and pass the tombs of kings from William Rufus to Edward VIII, pause for a moment. The marble looks cold, but beneath it once beat hearts that longed for warmth. Behind every title, His Majesty Defender of the Faith, Lord of the Realm, there was simply a person trying to love without breaking the rules. And as the night grows quiet, you realize that this story was never really about scandal at all. It's about humanity, the secret that no crown can ever fully hide. For centuries, England's kings hid their truest selves behind crowns, alliances, and carefully crafted legends, proof that even power can't silence the human heart. But where the kings whispered, one queen ruled with iron grace and endless secrets. Behind the lace and candlelight of Windsor, Queen Victoria's court concealed darkness the public was never meant to see. They say power smells like perfume and fear mixed together. You feel it the moment you step into Buckingham Palace. The wax-polished floors gleam so brightly you can see your face, though you might wish you couldn't. You're just a new attendant, still clutching your gloves, like a lifeline staring at corridors that seem to stretch longer than a sermon. But the quiet here isn't peaceful. It's the kind of silence that listens back. Every whisper bounces between gilt mirrors. Every shoe tap sounds like a confession. Your first lesson comes fast. Smiles are currency. The footmen smile. The ladies smile. Even the guards at the gates manage something that looks suspiciously polite. But underneath all that civility, you can feel something coiled, waiting, a sense that one wrong phrase could send you tumbling down a staircase faster than tea can cool. Have you ever worked somewhere where everyone's manners feel rehearsed, like the script of a play that never ends? That's Buckingham 1840s edition. When Queen Victoria glides through the hallway, you notice how the air changes. No one breathes until she's gone. She's tiny, yes, but commands the room like a thunderclap. Her dress rustles with thousands of pounds of silk and ego. A little woman, with a big empire, one diplomat once muttered, but no one dares say that out loud here. She's not just the queen. She's the orbit everything else revolves around. And around her orbit whirl 1,000 invisible moons, ladies-in-waiting courtiers, equerries, secretaries, all calculating how close they can get without burning. You soon realize the palace is less like a home and more like a hive. Even gossip has a rank here, lowly chatter in the kitchens, refined rumor in the salons. The cooks trade jokes about overcooked pheasant, while upstairs, a duchess leaks the same secret over crystal glasses of sherry. Everyone pretends not to know what everyone already knows. In the mornings, you carry messages through long halls painted with ancestors who all look faintly disappointed. The portraits never blink, yet somehow you feel watched. Victoria likes to keep things neat, predictable. Breakfast at 8, audiences at 10, political lectures from Albert by noon. You think of her as England itself, structured, punctual, a bit overbearing. But the palace isn't nearly as clean as its marble floors suggest. Behind the curtains, dust piles up in the form of unpaid favors and carefully hidden scandals. One evening, as you adjust a vase in the drawing room, you overhear a conversation between two maids. "She's having another fit," whispers one. Over a letter. They don't say whose letter. In this place, letters mean everything. A note folded wrong can end a career. A misplaced seal can expose an affair. You begin to see the system for what it is, a machine built on discretion. Keep the queen pleased, and you might rise. Offend her, and you vanish like yesterday's court circular. Outside London is changing steam engines, telegraphs, and a middle class starting to believe it deserves velvet curtains too. But inside these palace walls, time runs slower, bound by tradition and superstition. Even candles must burn at a certain pace during evening receptions. You wonder, do all empires start like this? With people pretending that etiquette can hold chaos at bay. You pass the library one night and spot Prince Albert hunched over blueprints by lamplight. He's mapping a railway line, eyes gleaming with a kind of rational obsession. The Queen's voice echoes faintly through the door, impatient, precise. You can't hear the words, but the tone tells you everything here. Love is management. Affection, a form of governance. Still, not everything feels grim. The palace has its small comedies. You've seen a duke lose his wig during a curtsy, a footman accidentally bow to a statue, and a parrot belonging to one of the princesses that screams, "God save the Queen," whenever someone sneezes. The humor is what keeps you sane. Even Victoria herself occasionally laughs, usually at someone else's expense, but laughter nonetheless. Late at night, when the gas lights dim and the corridors stretch like dreams, you find yourself thinking about how odd it is that a woman who rules a quarter of the world still has to worry about what her cousin in Hanover thinks. Maybe that's the secret of monarchy. It's never as free as it looks. The chandeliers may dazzle, but the court lives in perpetual performance. You start to see why some servants speak of the palace as a theater, velvet curtains, rehearsed lines, and an audience that never goes home. As you drift past the courtyard, where carriages clatter away into the fog, you sense that something deeper runs under this glittering surface. The politeness feels too polished, the loyalty too loud. Somewhere beneath the marble and manners, something is stirring, something the Queen herself may not fully control. The next morning smells like beeswax and hypocrisy. You're polishing a banister when two lords stroll past, debating morality as if it's a new brand of cigar. The Queen sets the example, one says. Indeed, answers the other, and we must follow her virtue within reason. You almost laugh. At court, virtue is just another currency traded quietly behind fans and folded letters. Everyone here is obsessed with appearances. You learn quickly that sin doesn't matter if you can smile through it. A duchess may ruin a reputation before breakfast, then attend chapel by noon, with a face so angelic, even the priest blushes. You start to realize that this is not a court of saints, but of actors, each one rehearsing moral perfection, while the backstage smells suspiciously of gin and secrets. Victoria herself promotes propriety with missionary zeal. Her speeches brim with talk of duty, decency, and domestic purity. She lectures her daughters on modesty, as if the fate of the empire depends on it. But here's the twist. Those same sermons float through halls where notes pass between gloved hands and doors click shut just a bit too softly. Have you ever met someone who's so strict about other people's behavior that you just know they're hiding something? Multiply by a few hundred, and you've got Victorian high society. Lord Melbourne, the Queen's first Prime Minister, an unofficial emotional crutch, knows this game well. He teaches her how to navigate gossip with a mixture of charm and denial. Never explain, he advises, never complain. A motto fit for any ruler or anyone with skeletons rattling behind silk curtains. Melbourne's affection for Victoria borders on paternal, yet tongues wag that it might not be purely so. No one says it aloud, but the knowing glances do the talking. Downstairs, the servants mirror their masters. Gossip trickles down like spilled champagne. The butler knows who sneaks where the laundress knows which linens tell which story. Every class pretends the other is worse. It's an elegant chain of hypocrisy linking every floor of the palace. Even the chapel choir hums a little louder when someone important is rumored to have fallen ill after a mysterious weekend in Brighton. And yet, for all their moral sermons, the Victorians excel at compartmentalizing. They invent new words just to avoid naming what they fear calling flirtation, a delicate attachment scandal, an unfortunate misunderstanding, and illegitimate children wards. It's linguistic gymnastics worthy of an Olympic medal. You imagine a modern HR department run by Victorians. Every affair becomes team building, every bribe a token of gratitude. You witness one evening reception where the air practically sparkles with tension. Victoria sits rigid on her throne, her expression carved from marble. Behind her, Albert stands like a portrait of morality itself, his sideburns as disciplined as his schedule. The courtiers glide through the ballroom, trading compliments sharp enough to cut glass. You realize this politeness is warfare conducted with teaspoons instead of swords. Occasionally, someone oversteps, like Lady Flora Hastings, a maid of honor, falsely accused of pregnancy in 1839. The poor woman was hounded by rumor until her death, all because Victoria disliked her. When an autopsy revealed she had cancer, not scandal, the Queen's popularity plummeted. It was a lesson Victoria never forgot. Public morality was a fragile crown, one bad whisper away from shattering. You can still hear servants talk about Lady Flora in hushed tones as if the ghost of gossip itself still stalks the corridors. Outside the palace, pamphleteers preach against sin, but inside the real sermons happen in the drawing rooms. You catch glimpses of it, the quick glance, the flutter of lace, the way someone's hand lingers on another's arm a moment too long. And you realize these people have mastered the art of pretending even to themselves. One night, you overhear a small scandal unfold in the servants' hall. A viscount's niece turns out to be not so related after all. The staff laughs quietly over pudding, but upstairs it's already being repackaged as a tragic story of charitable discretion. The palace spins truth faster than the new textile mills in Manchester. Still, the Queen clings to her ideal of moral reform. She supports charities, hospitals, and schools. Her sense of virtue isn't entirely hollow. It's just complicated. She believes in family loyalty and God, but also in hierarchy, obedience, and control. You start to see how morality here isn't about kindness. It's about order, the kind that keeps everyone commoner or countess neatly in their assigned place. As you finish your nightly duties, you pass through the corridor of portraits again. Their painted eyes seem to smirk now. They've seen it all before, the polite deceit, the rehearsed humility, and you can't help but wonder if Victoria's court was the moral compass of the empire. Which direction was it really pointing? The wax on the floor gleams back at you like a mirror of the age itself, shiny, spotless, and terribly good at hiding footprints. By now, you've learned that Buckingham Palace at night is louder than it pretends to be. The gas lamps hiss, the floorboards murmur, and somewhere in the Queen's wing bells ring with unsettling precision. 1 for her dresser, 2 for her page, 3 for the lady-in-waiting, who must appear immediately, hairpins in hand. You think back to your first week, how you believed the palace slept when the Queen did. Now you know better. The real business of power happens after midnight. You're sent tonight to deliver a tray of ink blotting paper and rosewater to the royal bedchamber. The corridors are quiet, but not peaceful. More like a stage waiting for the next scene. You pass the guards who don't meet your eye, the portraits that seem to lean closer, and finally, the heavy door with its carved initials VR. You knock, and a voice answers, soft, clipped, unmistakably imperial. Inside, you find the queen, half dressed for bed, surrounded by attendants who move like dancers in a ritual. One brushes her hair exactly 100 times. Another folds her lace gown with military precision. You hover in the background, watching this ceremony of control disguised as intimacy. The queen's bed, enormous and draped in crimson velvet, looks less like a place to sleep and more like a throne in disguise. What strikes you most isn't opulence, but the routine. Every movement rehearsed, every whisper measured. The maid who lights the fire must never turn her back on the queen. The footman who delivers letters must bow before retreating exactly 3 steps. To outsiders, these might seem like charming traditions, but inside these walls, they're survival tactics. You soon learn that the queen's private life is anything but private. Her correspondence passes through secretaries, her meals through tasters, her wardrobe through attendants sworn to discretion. Yet gossip leaks through seams tighter than her corsets. Which perfume she favors, which physician she trusts, whether the prince consort sleeps in her chamber or his own. You begin to wonder, does any monarch ever truly close their door? On some nights, Victoria's temper becomes legend. She scolds a maid for folding a handkerchief wrong, dismisses a groom for sneezing in her presence. Yet moments later, she may laugh or cry, or summon Albert with a letter that begins, "My dearest angel." You can feel the strange mixture of dominance and dependence that defines her reign. She demands order not just from her servants, but from her own emotions. In these late hours, her relationship with Albert feels almost like a negotiation. She leans on him for advice, yet resents his authority. When he corrects her spelling in official letters, she fumes. When he presents plans for reform, she listens grudgingly. You imagine a modern couple arguing over emails and calendar invites, except their disagreements shape the destiny of an empire. Once, as you linger outside the bedchamber, you overhear a curious sound laughter. Real laughter. Victoria and Albert sharing a private joke about one of the prime ministers. It's disarming, almost tender. Then just as quickly it's gone, the queen resumes her role and the room freezes again. You realize that in this palace, affection must always report for duty. You get used to odd sights. The royal undergarments being inspected by 2 maids as if they were sacred relics. The clock set 5 minutes fast, so the queen is never late. The guard dogs that roam the hall, rumored to have names like Dash and Discipline. Even her bed has rules. It faces east toward the sunrise, symbol of duty renewed. One morning, the queen orders the chamber curtains replaced because the light reminds her too much of her childhood home, Kensington Palace, where her mother ruled her life like a warden. It's strange how power and trauma share the same address. You see flashes of that child still hidden inside her, terrified of betrayal, desperate for control. Perhaps that's why her routines are so strict. Repetition makes chaos behave. Downstairs, the rest of the household whispers about the bell code. Everyone knows it. The difference between a short ring impatience and a long one rage. Some nights, the bells echo so frequently that the guards joke she's composing symphonies of fury. Yet every servant rushes to obey, terrified of being replaced. No one lasts long here, unless they master silence. You begin to understand that the royal bedchamber is less about sleep and more about surveillance. Every lock has a key someone else keeps. Every secret has already been overheard by someone polishing the floor. When you carry a message to the Queen's physician, you notice his nervous eyes. He's seen things he'll never confess. Maybe that's the true secret of royalty. Privacy costs loyalty, and both are paid for with fear. Sometimes, when you leave the Queen's wing at dawn, the world outside smells of coal and rain. The city stirs awake. Somewhere clerks are late for work, mothers scold children, and chimney smoke curls lazily into the gray sky. Normal life feels almost alien now. You've spent too long in a place where people sleep in velvet and wake in politics. As you walk back through the courtyard, a sparrow lands on a statue of Albert. For a moment it chirps, unbothered by the guards or the marble. You catch yourself smiling. In a palace that worships order, a single bird has the freedom no one else does. Power can be romantic until you realize it's just marriage wearing a crown. The first time you see Queen Victoria and Prince Albert together, it feels less like watching lovers and more like witnessing a business partnership sealed in lace and ceremony. Their eyes lock across the drawing room, not with longing, but with assessment. Two sovereigns calculating how to make a dynasty work. You'd think royal marriage would be a love story, written in rose petals and orchestras. In truth, it's more like a constitutional committee with better costumes. Victoria adores Albert. She calls him her angel, her perfect love. But she also signs his paychecks, commands his calendar, and occasionally bans him from meetings when he forgets his place. Imagine managing your spouse and your empire at the same time. One misplaced sigh, and someone loses a continent. Albert, to his credit, brings German efficiency to British chaos. He reorganizes the palace accounts, streamlines correspondence, and even sets up a new drainage system after one too many royal noses complain about the smell. He's the sort who believes moral order begins with clean pipes and punctual breakfasts. You can't help but admire him and pity him. The British public mocks his accent. Parliament distrusts his influence, and half the court whispers that the Queen's German experiment will never last. Still, they function like a well-oiled machine. She provides charisma. He supplies competence. Together, they craft the image of domestic perfection parents, of 9 guardians, of morality rulers, who dine together at precisely 7:30 p.m. But beneath that polished portrait lies constant tension. Victoria despises being corrected, and Albert can't resist correcting her. The result? Occasional domestic storms, as courtiers politely call them. You remember, one morning vividly, the sound of raised voices behind the Queen's door, followed by Albert storming down the corridor, face-pale gloves clenched. An hour later, Victoria appears for an audience with ministers as if nothing happened. Every curl in place, every smile sharpened to diamond hardness. That's the magic trick of monarchy. Make the cracks look like marble veins. Albert's obsession with productivity soon spreads through the palace. He designs new uniforms for the guards, drafts plans for the Great Exhibition of 1851, and lectures anyone within reach about the virtue of hard work. His motto might as well be, "No naps in the Empire." Even you start walking faster, just to avoid his disapproving glance. He treats laziness like a moral failing and innovation like a holy duty. When the Great Exhibition finally opens in Hyde Park, you go along as part of the household staff. The Crystal Palace glitters in the sun. A cathedral of glass filled with steam engines looms and globes. Albert beams as the crowds pour in declaring Britain the workshop of the world. You feel swept up in it, all the hum of invention, the optimism of progress. Yet in the corner of your eye, you spot a small sign. Do not touch the displays. That's the essence of Victorian modernity. Admire advancement, but keep your gloves on. Victoria adores Albert's brilliance, but hates being outshone by it. She writes in her diary, "We women are not meant to govern alone." Yet the irony is clear. She's the most powerful woman on earth. The contradiction defines her life. She demands obedience from millions, but longs to be guided by one man. In moments of honesty, she confesses her insecurities to Albert, her fear of failure, her loneliness behind the crown. He comforts her with logic, which is about as useful as a map in a storm. In quieter moments, they stroll through the palace gardens, their children tumbling like well-dressed ducklings behind them. You watch from a respectful distance. It almost looks ordinary, two parents, a family sunlight through the trees. But even their picnics are political. Every laugh, every gesture is observed, reported, discussed. Victoria's motherhood becomes part of her brand. The model family the newspapers call them. A PR miracle before PR existed. Of course, not everyone buys it. Radical writers mock their moralizing. Some call Albert a Prussian spy. Others accuse the Queen of being too domestic for a ruler. Yet she persists, turning public doubt into imperial propaganda. If she can be both wife and empress, then surely Britain can conquer both home and world. It's genius and exhausting. You start noticing how their relationship shapes the entire palace. Servants walk straighter when Albert's near. Ministers lower their voices when Victoria frowns. Even the palace clocks seem to tick more obediently, as if time itself fears disapproval. But perfection has a cost. Behind the immaculate image, both seem trapped in the very ideal they created. Late one night, you pass the royal study and glimpse them through the half-open door. Albert reads by lamplight, Victoria sketching quietly nearby. For a fleeting second, they look peaceful, two souls resting from empire. Then a knock at the door shatters it. Another crisis, another report, another signature. They exchange a glance that says, "Everything love postponed by duty again." You walk away realizing this is what power does. It takes even tenderness and puts it on a schedule. Grief doesn't whisper in palaces, it echoes. You sense it before you even see her. The curtains are drawn, the clocks muffled, and black crepe hangs like sorrow turned into fabric. Prince Albert is dead. The man who turned the empire into a well-oiled clock has stopped ticking, and the Queen refuses to accept the silence. It happens in December 1861, but inside Buckingham it feels like time itself has been buried with him. You arrive with a message and find the corridors dimmed, the air heavy with lavender and loss. Victoria, once so commanding, now moves like a ghost of herself, dressed in mourning black eyes, rimmed with sleeplessness. She orders every mirror covered. She bans music. Even laughter sounds treasonous now. You think back to their partnership, all that structure and precision. Now the system runs on memory and superstition. She keeps Albert's rooms exactly as he left them. The papers on his desk, the shaving brush still damp, his watch still wound. Servants must dust around these relics like archaeologists preserving a sacred site. Each morning, she insists that his clothes be laid out, as if he'll walk in any minute. Her grief becomes policy. Ministers wait weeks for audiences because she refuses to appear in public. Courtiers whisper that the Queen has vanished into widowhood. Yet from this solitude, she creates something new, a kingdom ruled by mourning. Black becomes the color of loyalty, silence the language of devotion. You deliver a letter to her private secretary one evening and catch a glimpse through the half-open door. Victoria kneeling beside Albert's portrait lips, moving in quiet conversation. It's unsettling and tender all at once. You wonder how long can one live with the dead before becoming one of them. Soon a new figure appears in her life, John Brown, a Scottish servant with rough manners and unshakable loyalty. He calls her woman to her face, something that would have gotten anyone else dismissed or worse. Yet she tolerates him, even smiles. Rumors ignite instantly. Is he her companion? Her comfort? Her scandal? You can never be sure. All you know is that whenever Brown's around, the Queen seems less like a ghost and more like a person. The courtiers despise him. They call him the Highland rascal, mock his accent, sneer at his familiarity. But he doesn't care. He treats Victoria not as a symbol, but as a human being, a dangerous kind of affection in a world that worships titles. The Queen defends him fiercely, even writes his honesty and devotion are unmatched. Of course, the public turns this into something else. Cartoonists draw them side by side in compromising poses. Newspapers whisper of secret marriages and Scotch influence. You watch it unfold and realize in mourning, Victoria has traded politics for myth. Her grief spreads beyond the palace. Memorials rise like mushrooms after rain statues, museums, even a mausoleum carved into marble devotion. She demands that the world remember Albert as the paragon of virtue, the model husband, the moral heart of empire. In doing so, she turns mourning into machinery. Sorrow becomes propaganda. And yet grief doesn't make her soft, it hardens her. She distrusts ministers who urge her to resume duties. She avoids London, calling it the wicked city. She retreats to Balmoral, her beloved Scottish estate, where she and Brown ride through misty hills in near silence. There, she claims to feel Albert's presence more strongly than anywhere else. Perhaps she believes that if she keeps her rituals, he'll keep existing. You begin to see how her personal sorrow reshapes public life. The empire mirrors her mourning black dresses, somber etiquette, strict propriety. Even widows across Britain mimic the Queen's habits, as if grief itself has become fashionable. You hear one housemaid mutter, "We're all in mourning for someone we never met." When spiritualism sweeps through England, Victoria takes notice. Seances, mediums, crystal balls. The Victorians adore speaking with the departed, and the Queen is no exception. Rumor says she once sought messages from Albert through a medium at Windsor. Whether it's true or not, you can almost imagine her hand trembling over a candlelit table, waiting for her angel to tap back from beyond. Her fixation on death reshapes everything: court protocol, royal architecture, even fashion. Mourning jewelry becomes a craze. Lockets of hair, jet black brooches, rings engraved with initials of the lost. It's as if the entire empire starts wearing its sadness on its sleeve. But behind solemnity lies control. The Queen's grief keeps the nation loyal. Pity turns into reverence. Who would dare criticize a widow? One foggy evening, you walk through the palace gardens and spot her silhouette by the window, small, unmoving, outlined against the candlelight. The woman who once ruled continents now rules memory itself. You realize that in losing Albert, she found a new kind of power, the ability to command sympathy as effectively as she once commanded armies. The bells of St. James's ring in the distance solemn and slow. Somewhere in London, factories' thunder ships depart, and the empire continues as if nothing has changed. But inside these walls, time remains still frozen. At the hour, Albert's heart stopped. And you polishing the Queen's silver can't help but think, when a monarch mourns, an entire empire holds its breath. You can tell trouble is brewing the moment laughter returns to the palace. It doesn't belong to Victoria. It belongs to her eldest son, Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales. Where his mother thrives on discipline, Bertie, as the family calls him, thrives on distraction. He's everything she's not: charming, impulsive, fond of parties that start too late and end in whispers. The first time you see him, he's stepping out of a carriage surrounded by the scent of cigars and expensive cologne, waving to the crowd like a man who's never known fear. The Queen calls him her naughty boy, though he's nearly 30. You quickly learn that Bertie is both adored and dangerous, a royal magnet for trouble wrapped in velvet. Victoria, still mourning, despairs of him. He lacks seriousness, she writes, meaning he laughs too loudly and kisses too easily. She's right about both. You watch him flirt his way through drawing rooms, tossing compliments like coins, each one polished and meaningless. He loves soldiers, gamblers, and actresses, the trifecta of scandal in any century. One particular evening, he hosts a private gathering at Sandringham, his country estate. You're there as part of the serving staff. The air smells of champagne and mischief. The laughter too quick, the candles too bright. There's music, dancing, and a guest list that would make the Queen faint: theater stars, aristocrats, a few men whose titles seem suspiciously invented. You move quietly through the room, hearing snippets of gossip, secret debts, flirtations disguised as politics, and jokes about the Queen's endless mourning. Then comes the scandal that makes even the footmen go pale. A certain Lady Harriet Mordaunt is discovered to have named the prince himself in her divorce trial. The implication? Adultery. The trial becomes front-page sensation, the first true royal sex scandal of the modern press. Victoria is livid. Bertie insists on his innocence, of course, but you can feel the frost spreading through Buckingham like a slow winter. The Queen writes, "I cannot bear to look upon him." You watch how the court divides. Some whisper that Bertie's antics might destroy the monarchy. Others argue he's the very image of modern Britain, youthful, restless, willing to break rules. The public oddly loves him more for it. They see in him what they secretly envy: freedom from the suffocating moral corset his mother stitched around the empire. Still, the scandals don't stop. There's the infamous Tranby Croft affair, where the prince's circle is caught cheating at cards. There's a duel involving one of his friends, a mysterious Parisian dancer, and too much champagne. The Queen despairs, but you sense that Bertie enjoys his role as the family's black sheep. Better to be talked about, he once says, than forgotten. Yet beneath the laughter and luxury lies danger. Britain's newspapers are getting bolder. Journalists sniff around royal gossip like foxes around a chicken coop. One headline calls him the Prince of Pleasure. Another hints that the monarchy itself might be losing its moral authority. You realize the empire's greatest threat isn't rebellion, it's ridicule. Bertie, however, remains strangely unfazed. He loves horses, hunting, and the theater. You once catch him backstage congratulating an actress with a kiss that lingers just a second too long. The courtiers pretend not to see, but the stagehands do, and stagehands talk. Within days, half of London knows. The irony is sharp. The same era that worships Victorian morality is secretly obsessed with its own sinners. People devour gossip about the prince's escapades the way they read serialized novels, shocked, delighted, judgmental, and jealous all at once. The more he misbehaves, the more human he seems. And perhaps that's the secret of his popularity. He sins the way his subjects wish they could. Meanwhile, Victoria retreats further into her sanctum, drowning in letters of reprimand and prayer. She blames herself, then blames society, then finally blames the age itself. The world grows coarse, she writes, and I too old to refine it. You can almost feel her loneliness pressing against the palace walls. Her empire stretches across oceans, yet she cannot reach her own sun. And you, watching from the sidelines, start to see history bending. The Victorian era, so proud of its restraint, is cracking open. The future will not wear black crape or bow its head. It will laugh, gamble, flirt, and forget. One night you deliver a sealed letter to Bertie. He opens it, reads, then sighs a sound halfway between guilt and exhaustion. Mother wants me to live as if I were already dead, he mutters. Then he smiles that famous, easy smile. But what's life for, if not to live it? As he walks away, his laughter echoing down the corridor, you realize that the Queen's carefully built kingdom of discipline has met its perfect opponent, not a rival monarch, not a rebellion, but her own heir. History has a cruel sense of humor. It gives with one hand and curses with the other. By the time you've learned how to navigate the court's scandals, a new specter haunts the palace. Not gossip, not politics, but blood itself. The royal family, for all its jewels and titles, carries a secret buried in its veins. Hemophilia, the royal disease. You hear the word, whispered, in hallways like a prayer and a curse combined. At first, it's only mentioned in connection with the Queen's youngest son, Prince Leopold. A kind boy, bright and soft-spoken, but prone to unexplained bruises and long recoveries from the slightest cut. In an age when doctors still prescribe leeches, no one quite understands what's happening. Some call it weak blood. Others blame divine punishment or bad luck. But in truth, it's genetics, an invisible chain that binds generations. Victoria herself carries the gene, though she doesn't know it. Through her daughters, the disease travels silently across Europe, turning royal weddings into epidemiological events. The Habsburgs, the Romanovs, the Spanish Bourbons, all receive their share of the royal curse. You can almost imagine a map of Europe, red lines drawn between palaces, tracing not alliances, but inherited pain. You first witness its cruelty when Leopold, barely 20, falls after a minor accident. The bleeding won't stop. Servants rush, physicians whisper, and you stand helplessly at the doorway, watching life drain faster than medicine can replace it. The Queen is devastated. She writes in her journal, "My dear boy, my poor darling boy." It's one of the few moments you've seen her faith falter. But grief doesn't stop her from arranging more marriages. After all, an empire needs connections. Her daughters marry into every crown available, spreading British blood and British disease across the continent. Europe's grandmother, the newspapers call her, unaware that some of those grandchildren will inherit more than her jawline. You hear rumors of a sickly Tsarevich in Russia, the son of her granddaughter, Alexandra, and Tsar Nicholas II. They say he bleeds for days from the smallest injury. They say his suffering changes the course of history, pulling a mystic named Rasputin into the royal circle and unraveling a dynasty. You realize that what began in Victoria's nursery may one day topple empires. Isn't it strange how history hides its biggest revolutions inside the smallest cells? In London, the Queen consults physicians, priests, and her own conscience. She prays fasts and writes of divine trials. The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away, she quotes. Yet deep down, you can sense her torment. For all her control over her court, her ministers, and her empire, she cannot command her own blood. Science, meanwhile, is catching up. Laboratories hum with curiosity. Theories of inheritance are spreading Mendel's peas. Darwin's finches, whispers of invisible laws governing who becomes strong and who becomes fragile. You find it ironic. Victoria's era gave birth to the concept of evolution. Yet her family stands as its most ironic proof that nature plays favorites. At the palace, you start noticing how cautious the royal nurses become. Every playtime is supervised, every tumble a potential crisis. The boys wear padded jackets, even indoors. Once you overhear a doctor remark, "The prince must live gently." You can't help but think, what kind of life is that for someone born to rule? The Queen continues to project strength to the public, but privately, she becomes increasingly preoccupied with health. She prescribes her grandchildren cod liver oil, insists on fresh air, and distrusts city physicians. God's will, she says, though her eyes betray a mother's guilt. Maybe power always comes with a price, and hers happens to be written in DNA. Outside the palace, people know only fragments of the truth. The newspapers hint at delicate constitutions and weak nerves. Victorian society, always obsessed with appearances, prefers euphemisms to honesty. You can see it everywhere, sickness wrapped in lace tragedy disguised as etiquette. Even death announcements are phrased like invitations the prince has entered eternal rest. But behind the masks, servants talk. They speak of blood that won't clot, of princes kept indoors, of doctors sworn to secrecy. You've polished enough silver to know that the shine always hides a flaw beneath. And this flaw, unlike gossip or rebellion, can't be silenced. It's hereditary, eternal. Years later, when Victoria grows older, she begins to see the full reach of her legacy. Her sons and daughters rule half of Europe, yet she writes, "I have given them both crowns and crosses." She doesn't mean religion. She means the invisible burden that will haunt her descendants long after her own funeral bells fade. One fog-draped evening, as you walk past the Queen's study, you see her bent over a letter, perhaps to one of her daughters in Germany, or her granddaughter in Russia. The candlelight flickers across her face, aged but resolute. For a moment you realize she understands her empire better than anyone else ever will. It's not the colonies, or the railways, or even the armies that define it. It's the fragile thread of blood that binds it all together, ready to snap at any moment. You learn the weight of an empire by lifting its souvenirs. The wooden crates arrive with tidy labels: India, Ireland, Africa, and the polite smell of camphor. Inside, there is nothing polite at all. Silk that crackles like lightning. Ivory that feels cold even in warm hands. Jewels that turn everyone, even the pious, into quiet accountants. You help unfasten a velvet-wrapped stone the size of a small egg, and the room goes silent. In that particular way, money makes people religious. Someone whispers, "Koh-i-Noor." You don't need the translation. Mountain of Light explains itself. The journey that brought it here reads like a ledger entry disguised as a fairy tale. After the Anglo-Sikh Wars and the Treaty of Lahore in 1849, the diamond is seated, which is the daintiest verb for a child Maharaja's signature under military shadow. A year later, it is presented to Victoria, and by 1851, It sits in the Crystal Palace, glinting behind glass, while crowds shuffle past with meat pie fingers and opinions. The public murmurs that it looks dull. Albert orders it recut in 1852, and brilliance is restored. If brightness could wash history clean, the palace would be a lighthouse. You pin the case card straight and try not to think about who watched this same stone leave their land under a different sky. In the ballroom, trophies make excellent conversation. A nabob's sword here, a lacquered casket there, a shawl that took 2 winters of someone's life to weave. Courtiers admire, measure, compare. How marvelous the workmanship, they say, as if craftsmanship were a plant watered best by conquest. You notice how easily the word gift slips into tongues that prefer not to pronounce seizure. Have you ever seen a living room shelf where every trinket has a story no one actually wants to tell? The palace is that shelf, just taller. Messages arrive that do not sparkle. In 1857, the bags bulge with dispatches stamped Delhi and Kanpur ink pressed deep by trembling clerks. The words chosen in Whitehall are tidy mutiny, disturbance, pacification. In the servants' hall, the synonyms are messier, and in the officers' letters smuggled home, they are messier still. You carry notes to ministers, while the Queen's face hardens into porcelain resolve. Lord Canning Clemency. Canning, to some with a sneer, writes about restraint. Others call for the opposite. On the night the news from Lucknow turns the palace, chandeliers burn late because strategy prefers good lighting. When the empire wishes to feel virtuous, it holds a fair. Albert's great exhibition becomes a catalogue of empire with tasteful captions, cashmere, jute, indigo tea. Machines thrum, flags ripple, and visitors leave, convinced that Providence now takes the train to work. You help adjust a placard that praises the benefits of British guidance, and you think of the indigo stains you once saw on a planter's hands, blue like bruises. The orchestra plays. No one claps on the offbeat. Victoria's titles multiply like ivy. Disraeli, all charm and perfume, crowns her Empress of India in 1876 with the Royal Titles Act, calling the step poetry of sovereignty. You deliver his letter and catch her smile, small and electric. She adores the theater of it, the peacock shimmer without the peacock's shriek. At the 1877 Delhi Durbar, where she is present only by proclamation and portrait, viceroys and princes arrange themselves like a human brooch. Telegrams tick into the palace describing tents like cities and elephants like parades of moving hills. You pour tea for a minister who sighs magnificent, and you wonder how often magnificence is just expense made public. Not all telegrams fit the music. During the Indian famine of 1876-78, reports of failed monsoons and empty granaries keep arriving, each one folded flatter, as if paper could be starved of urgency. Relief committees meet budgets, argue with ethics, and London's fog does its famous job of hiding things. You hear a priest pray over a list of names and watch a civil servant quietly move that list to the bottom of a blotting pile. One afternoon, you carry a sealed pouch past a corridor where someone says, exports must be maintained the way a doctor might say pulse must be kept. You learn how policy can be a sentence without a subject. Ireland writes to the palace too earlier in the reign during the Great Famine of the 1840s. The Queen donates publicly visits in 1849, does the things a constitutional sovereign can do inside the glass walls of her role. In Kensington prints, she is shown as comforter-in-chief, and the engravings sell well. You stand behind a photographer's tripod years later, lining up a Jubilee portrait, and wonder how hunger ever fits into a frame. Crates keep arriving, even as the century darkens. In 1897, after a punitive expedition, whose adjectives do heavy lifting bronzes from Benin, begin their long detour into British glass cases. The labels say acquired, which is grammar doing acrobatics without a safety net. You hold one plaque a courtier, frozen in metal, with a posture almost familiar, and you feel the unnerving sensation that art sometimes looks back. The Viceroy's secretary, passing by, calls the pieces ethnographic triumphs. You tuck the word away with others that mean what they do not say. There are audiences that smell like a garden, and audiences that smell like a ledger. Indian princes present swords and gem-studded harnesses, then depart into rain that doesn't understand ceremony. A Maharaja, no older than the page who takes his cloak, bows with a grace that keeps everyone from seeing the arithmetic behind it, subsidies, treaties, disarmaments, all spelled in a script different from his mother tongue. You bring a cooling drink and glimpse the ghost of a boy named Duleep Singh, visiting earlier in the reign, the child who signed his kingdom away and later posed in London suits that fit everywhere except the past. Jubilees varnish everything. In 1887 and 1897, colonial troops marched through London like a moving atlas. Drums, turbans, plumes, boots, a geography test with brass polish. The crowds roar, newspapers fold their adjectives into origami swans, and the queen becomes not a person, but a pageant, as if grief and governance could be solved with a longer parade. You help pin medals onto a sash that already has more metal than fabric, and think about how decorations are simply stories that learn to shine. Occasionally, a visitor breaks the script. An Indian reformer speaks softly about rights and representation. A missionary mentions schools that teach English but forget hunger. A civil servant brings data that refuse to curtsy. You notice how the palace absorbs criticism, the way thick carpets absorb footsteps silently, without echo, until the dust is beaten out somewhere private. A courtier tells you, do not confuse noise with harm. The next week, a memorandum arrives asking that future briefings avoid distressing particulars during dinner hours. At night, when the corridor's empty and the trophies sit with their labels like name tags at a party, where no one knows anyone, you walk past the Koh-i-Noor's case and watch its facets catch a lamp's small flame. It is very beautiful. It is also a biography written by other people. You wonder whether objects feel the rooms they occupy, whether glass cases have memories, whether a jewel can be tired of being proof. Somewhere beyond the railings, ships scrape the Thames, warehouses breathe grain and salt, and clerks tally numbers that will be read by men who never see the faces attached to them. The empire works as designed wealth moves toward light sorrow, toward the margins, and the palace sleeps under a quilt of imported silk, while the city dreams in coal. You set the last velvet rope straight and let the darkness finish the rest of the dusting. If you could bottle the smell of Victorian medicine, it would probably be equal parts ether roses and wishful thinking. You begin to notice that everyone at court, from duchess to doorman, has their own remedy. Laudanum for nerves, tincture of opium for coughs, coca wine for melancholy. Even the queen keeps her own little cabinet of tonics cordials, the apothecary calls them, though they could tranquilize a horse. Doctors come and go through the palace like bees through a garden, each buzzing a different theory. Some swear by bloodletting, others by baths so cold they could stop gossip mid-sentence. The royal physician, Sir James Clark, prescribes rest, fresh air, and the minimum of excitement. You can't help thinking that's rather rich advice for a woman running an empire. Victoria takes her medicine with stoic precision drops, counted glass-rinsed lips, pursed like a soldier swallowing pride. But the tonics aren't just for her. The palace runs on stimulants. Courtiers sip sherry for the circulation. Ladies nibble arsenic wafers for the complexion. Even the maids chew peppermint leaves, laced with alcohol, before long receptions. Everyone's health is a small performance, and medicine is the prop that keeps the show going. You once overhear a visiting American remark, "This whole country's half asleep and half drunk, and they call it refinement." He isn't wrong. Pain is rarely spoken of directly. It's hidden beneath phrases like a touch of the vapors or a faint indisposition. You once find a note from a lady in waiting explaining her absence. Laudanum took its hold. I fear I am too serene for duty. You imagine a world where serenity itself can be overdosed. Have you ever seen a smile that looks suspiciously like numbness? At Victoria's court, it's practically uniform. The Queen's pregnancies, 9 in total, turned childbirth into state business. Each labor announced each recovery, observed by ministers who discuss her womb as if it were a railway schedule. Anesthesia arrives in 1853 when she birthed Prince Leopold. The press calls it chloroform à la reine, and suddenly every respectable woman wants a sniff of the royal trend. Some clergymen denounce it as defying God's will. Victoria waves them off with the practical wisdom of someone who's been through this too many times. I am sure the Almighty will not think it wrong, she writes, to have relieved pain. You silently agree if anyone deserves morphine and a nap, it's her. But medicine has a way of blurring lines. Pain relief becomes recreation. Prescriptions become indulgence. The royal apothecary's records read like the script of a Gothic novel, chloral, hydrate morphia, ether, port wine. The Victorians have discovered chemistry, and they use it like perfume to disguise the body's complaints. You wonder if anyone here has ever truly slept without help. Albert, before his death, had experimented with what he called scientific living. He measured diet-tracked pulses, believed the body could be governed by data as neatly as a clock. After his passing, the Queen clings to ritual instead of reason. She writes of dream spirits and divine signs, often aided by whatever tincture dulls the grief that still howls under her corset. At times, her attendants worry she might not distinguish visions from visitations. One night you hear her murmuring that Albert's presence fills the room again. The physician notes mild hallucinations due to exhaustion. You think perhaps they're both right. Medicine and empire intertwine neatly. Quinine for malaria in India, morphine for the soldiers in Crimea, disinfectant for the hospitals. Florence Nightingale fights to reform. You hear her name often, that remarkable nurse people say, sometimes admiringly, sometimes as if cleanliness were a political statement. In a way, it is. The Queen praises her publicly, but keeps her at a distance. Reformers make rulers nervous. Antiseptic light is hard on gilded paint. You notice how quickly remedies become fashion. Electric therapy machines hum through salons promising vigor. Gentlemen experiment with galvanic belts to restore vitality. Someone even markets a device called the Pulvermacher chain that looks suspiciously like a torture instrument but sells out by Christmas. You begin to suspect that the Victorians will try to electrify anything that sits still too long, including morality. Among the servants, simpler cures prevail. Onion poultices for colds, gin for courage, gossip for despair. The palace doctor frowns upon all three, but secretly practices number 2. One night, when you mention a toothache, he offers a teaspoon of brandy and says, "There now, You're practically aristocracy. The burn is immediate, the pain unchanged, but you both pretend it helps. You can't ignore the darker side of all this progress. Children sold patent medicines containing opium, women dying from beauty tonics made of lead, factories pumping arsenic dyes into green dresses that literally poison their wearers. The Victorians adore novelty, the way moths adore flames. They don't notice the burning until it's too late. And through it all, Victoria endures. She suffers migraines, rheumatism, and bouts of what doctors politely call melancholia. She treats each with the discipline of a soldier. Medicine taken, prayers, said correspondents answered. Pain becomes routine grief, a daily vitamin. Sometimes you wonder whether she's still human beneath all that endurance, or something harder forged by habit and hurt. Late one night, you pass her chamber and see her writing by lamplight, a bottle of laudanum beside her pen. The flame trembles with her hand. She pauses, looks toward Albert's portrait, then resumes her letter. You can't read the words, but you recognize the rhythm. It sounds like someone trying to outright their pain. In the morning, the bottles are gone, replaced by the faint smell of roses. The palace wakes to another day of perfect routine, and no one mentions the night at all. Every empire runs on illusion, but few stage it as beautifully as Queen Victoria's court. By the 1880s, you can feel the machinery of myth working harder than ever, like a gas lamp flickering brighter just before it burns out. The queen, older now smaller, within her gowns, rules not by proximity, but by presence. She rarely appears in London, yet her image multiplies everywhere: portraits, coins, biscuit tins, postage stamps. She's less a monarch now than an atmosphere. God save the Queen, the crowd still shout, but they're really saluting the idea of her, the grieving widow, the moral mother, the imperial grandmother, who never quite smiles, but somehow watches over everything. It's astonishing, really, how a life of isolation became a brand of unity. You begin to suspect that Victoria intentionally or not mastered public relations before the term even existed. The palace hums like a stage crew behind curtains. Press officers, courtiers, and secretaries orchestrate every glimpse the public gets. When she opens Parliament, every camera is positioned just so. When she rides in the Golden Jubilee carriage in 1887, her frailty itself becomes part of the performance, a symbol of endurance rather than decay. You stand among the staff, lining the mall, watching the crowds weep as she passes, barely moving eyes hidden behind a veil. It's strange. People cheer louder for a ghost than they ever did for a queen of flesh. You've long since learned how carefully this magic is maintained. Scandals disappear faster than ink dries. One editor receives a quiet invitation to dine at Windsor. Another finds a knighthood suddenly on the horizon. An unpleasant headline simply, "Stop." Even painters cooperate. Official portraits erase wrinkles as efficiently as any modern filter app. History, it turns out, is retouched by brush before it's written by pen. Yet danger always lurks in the crowd. There are assassination attempts, at least 6 across her reign. The first in 1840, when Edward Oxford fired his pistol and missed. Then others followed Pate with his cane bean, with his misfire Maclean, with his madness. Each time Victoria refused to hide. She wrote again the very next day, declaring, "I will not let the cowards frighten me." You almost believe her bravery isn't rehearsed, but instinctive, born of defiance and stubborn pride. Still, after each attempt, security tightens, and you feel the invisible bars grow thicker around her life. By the 1890s, the palace is half fortress, half theater. every entrance, guarded every visitor, vetted every letter steamed open before it ever reaches her hands. When you walk through the courtyard at night, you hear the clatter of soldiers drilling beneath windows that glow with lamplight and loneliness. The queen rarely sleeps without a guard posted within earshot. Sometimes, when you pass her sitting room, she's gazing at portraits of Albert and her children, surrounded by a silence so deep it feels physical. The world still calls her powerful. You see someone kept safe by isolation, and still she works. Dispatch boxes filled with papers from India, Ireland, Canada, Africa, Australia. Her empire spans the time zones of insomnia. Her handwriting trembles now, yet the will behind it doesn't. She writes, "I feel responsible before God for my people," and you almost believe she means every word. But responsibility and reality seldom share the same desk. Reports of famine, rebellion, and poverty lie buried beneath ribbons of red tape and the scent of sealing wax. You've delivered enough memoranda to know that empire always looks cleanest before it's opened. Her later years bring both triumph and parody. Jubilee parades wind through streets, choked with banners, proclaiming "Long live the Queen," and you can hear street vendors selling commemorative mugs beside beggars, holding out hands for coins with her face on them. It's a surreal balance, glory and hunger sharing the same air. Yet the illusion holds because the empire needs it to. Hope always travels better when wrapped in pageantry. One fog-soaked evening, you accompany an official photographer setting up for yet another portrait session at Osborne House. The Queen is seated near a window, the Isle of White mist making her look half-carved from it. She asks for one less light. "Too bright," she murmurs. "We mustn't frighten the years away." The camera clicks, capturing that timeless half-smile, the expression that built a century of stability on grief and stubbornness. When the glass plate develops, you can see both Victoria and the shadow of the empire behind her, fading, but still magnificent. You start to realize that the monarchy itself has become a mirror people see in it whatever comforts them. To the rich, it's proof of order. To the poor, proof that someone eternal still watches over chaos. But mirrors, you know, always lie a little. The Queen herself once said, "We are not amused." You wonder if that phrase, repeated endlessly, was not boredom, but confession. Maybe she saw too much of the performance to enjoy it anymore. As the century wanes, the world begins to shift beneath the marble floors. Automobiles rattle through London streets. Wireless experiments whisper across the Atlantic. The colonies simmer. The old certainties, the moral codes, the divine right, even the empire's invincibility start to feel as fragile as the Queen's trembling hand. And yet, every morning, the palace bells still ring for breakfast, as they always have. Routine outlives revelation. When she finally dies in 1901, the news spreads like a weather report. The age itself has ended. The servants stand silent. The streets fill with black. Across the world, cannons fire in mourning. You stand by the palace gates, watching the carriages depart, each bearing someone who owes their fortune or their ruin to that small woman who once scolded maids for folding handkerchiefs incorrectly. As night falls, you wander back through the empty corridors of Buckingham. The air smells faintly of polish and lilies. The portraits stare, as they always have, fixed smiles, unblinking eyes, secrets sealed beneath varnish. Somewhere, a bell rings, once out of habit. You realize there will be no more signals to answer. Maybe that's what makes history both haunting and human. Even the grandest illusions end quietly. One breath, one signature, one monarch less. And yet as you step outside into the London fog, you can still feel her presence, half memory, half myth, lingering like the echo of a voice that refuses to fade. So now, as the palace fades into the hush of midnight, you breathe in the dust of